It's always funny to me whenever you actually stop and take a look at some of the phrases that a lot of us take for granted in Christianity or when it comes to our beliefs in general. For example, one of the things that I've heard people say before is that no sin is worse than any other. And I always hear that, and I have to stop and think, how must somebody who's not a Christian hear that? So, okay, you're going to tell me that lying about the fact that, I didn't like my dinner in reality is somehow equal with committing mass murder. That just obviously doesn't make any sense, right? And so, you can imagine somebody who's not a Christian hearing that and just going, that just sounds ridiculous from the get-go. And I think because it sounds so crazy, a lot of Christians tend to just not engage on some of these subjects, which is not what we want. Instead, I think whenever we hear something that really doesn't make any sense, we have to stop and actually be critical about it. And not critical as in just simply making fun of it or just saying it sounds stupid, but actually stopping and going, why does that sound insane? Is it that it actually makes more sense than I think? Or maybe the phrase is actually a bad phrase? Well, specifically with the one I just mentioned, talking about no sin is worse than any other, this is one of those things that when you look at the Bible, you actually end up finding out that no, there actually is something to some sin being greater. The million-dollar question is not whether some sins are greater than others, it's whether that matters. That's where we start seeing things equalize a little bit. So here in a second in your groups, what you guys are going to do is you're going to see an example of where Jesus talks about sin being greater in some instances, specifically when it comes to him talking about Pilate versus Judas. So go take a look at that. But after you take a look at how Jesus talks about something being greater than something else, then I want you to ask yourself, does it really matter? And then I think what we start to see is maybe it's not a matter of saying no sin is greater than any other, but instead it's more worthwhile to say no person is any more righteous than any other person. The distinction between the weight of sin and the penalty of sin is something that's not trivial. This isn't just like an academic thought. It actually does matter, and let me explain to you why. First, I want you to think of a metaphor here, if you will. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of people give statistics or little studies or whatnot on how many times different countries and nuclear stockpiles could destroy the earth. But it's kind of fascinating. People will say, well, Russia can destroy the earth many, many times over, and over more times than the U.S. could. And then the U.S. could destroy the earth many times more over than a country like China could, and so on and so forth. And while these statistics may sound interesting, they're kind of pointless because we only have one earth. It doesn't matter whether you can destroy the earth one time over or 1,000 times over. If you destroy it once, it's gone. Well, in the same way, the weight of your sin doesn't really matter because the penalty ends up being the same. If there's any sin in our lives, then we're deserving of death. And that's what we end up seeing in the scriptures. This is why Christ came and died on the cross. Because any amount of sin, no matter how righteous we attempted to act, if we had even the smallest amount of sin in our lives, then it was game over. And so think about what Christ did here. He said, okay, well, I'm going to come and pay the penalty for sin. But he came to pay the penalty. And if the penalty is the same, regardless of how much sin you have, then what you're left with is this. Christ's penalty that he paid on the cross was sufficient to cover any weight of sin. It doesn't matter how much you've done, how much you will do, how much you think you've done, because Christ paid it all. He did everything. And it's one of the reasons why it just seems so unfortunate for people to put qualifications on different individuals' ability to accept grace. You have different things that people can't wrap their heads around, like the idea of sufficient grace, so they create these mechanisms like purgatory, or they create these different ideas that you have to do atonement, or that somehow you have to do something to be sufficiently deserving of grace. But that completely works against what Christ was trying to accomplish here. What he did was paid the penalty. Because he paid the penalty, the weight is now irrelevant. So this is something that in your groups you guys are going to sit here and talk about, is the sufficiency of grace. And as you are talking about this, I want you to think about your own life. I want you to think about the own sin or the own burdens or guilt or whatever that you may have carried over the years. And then in thinking about that, I want you to stop and realize that Christ came to pay it all. And because he came to pay it all, it is sufficient for any burden that you may carry. In 1 John 1, verses 8 through 9, it says, "If we claim to have no sin, then we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. But if we confess our sin, he who is without sin will purify us and save us from all unrighteousness." When we see these words, what this is describing is the fact that we have sin in our lives. We all have things. No matter how much it may seem like somebody has everything all put together, we all have things we struggle with. We all have thoughts. We all have temptations. We all have struggles. This is something that doesn't make you a bad Christian. It doesn't make you somehow dirty. It doesn't make you somehow lesser than anybody else. It makes you human. But it makes you the exact kind of human that Christ came here on this earth to die for. He didn't come here to sit here and save people who felt like they had it all together. He came here to save the dregs of society. He came here to save the rejected. He came here to save the individuals that were carrying burdens that felt so overwhelming that they just couldn't get out of it. Christ came for the hopeless and offered them hope in the form of his own death on a cross. As we sit here and we get into the Easter season, it's important to understand that we're not sitting here celebrating a God that just performed miracles and did some neat things. It's not even just that he showed compassion to poor people or that he healed the sick. It's that Christ came to this earth for the explicit reason of paying the penalty for our sin so that the weight of anything we did would become entirely irrelevant. This is what we celebrate on Easter, and this is what we celebrate any time that we thank God for saving us for that from which we couldn't save ourselves. Christ paid it all, and his grace is sufficient for anything that you may be struggling with. That's our lesson that we have for you today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. And until we can meet again, God bless.